Thank you for having me on.
All right. Well, I'd first like to ask you about the gold and silver markets. Now, you were recently on Kitco News and you were saying that you were cautiously optimistic about the gold and silver space. Can you expand on this?
I am, and probably more optimistic about gold and silver equities for a change. We're in a position which I have seen twice before in my career where precious metals prices do well simultaneously with the US dollar doing well. Traditionally, the US dollar, and in particular US sovereign bonds, do well at the expense of gold and silver. But the first time in the second half of 1975, and then more lately in 2002, precious metals have done well in combination with the US dollar, which means that they've done extremely well in other currencies. A couple things that are interesting about this. In the first instance, if passed as prologue, in both other instances where that occurred, the US dollar rolled over and gold and silver did extremely well in the aftermath, both in 1975 and also in 2002. Probably also of importance, we have seen relative strength in the precious metals at the same time that the precious metals equities have lagged. This lag is probably explained by the incredible outperformance of the precious metals equities in 2016 and the fact that they needed, if you will, to take a breather. But I think the relatively good performance of gold and silver without follow through from the equities means that it is likely that the equities at some point in time this year will experience a bit of a catch-up move, which I think is very attractive. So yes, I'm optimistic about gold and silver, and I'm more optimistic about the precious metals equities for 2016, for the balance of 2017, pardon me.
Now, how do you think a Trump presidency will impact the mining sector?
I think the Trump presidency will provide a bunch of narratives, both positive and negative for precious metals. But I don't think he'll matter very much. I think the truth is that the precious metals will do well as a function of arithmetic, not the narrative. I think that $20 trillion in on-balance sheet liabilities at the federal government level, plus an apparent $1.5 trillion deficit before Mr. Trump hopes to make good on his infrastructure spending, means that gold and silver will likely do well at the expense of U.S. government debt at any rate. I think that the arithmetic associated with the deficit is more important than any part of the Trump narrative. People seize on the narrative to justify actions that they take for other reasons. But I suspect, as I say, that precious metals will do well relative to the U.S. dollar, simply because the U.S. dollar strength isn't really a function of strength in the U.S. economy, but rather is a function of weakness in other economies. And the consequence of that is that I think almost irrespective of what Trump does, he will only be an excuse for gold, not a factor in the gold price move.
Now, you said that the strength in the U.S. dollar is not reflective of the strength of the U.S. economy. Can you expand on that? So are you saying that the U.S. economy right now is not really as strong as it might appear?
It doesn't appear to me to be strong at any rate. I should caveat that by saying I'm not an economist. I'm a credit analyst. But I think that the U.S. economy still has some challenges. It doesn't have challenges perhaps relative to, say, Japan, that has greater balance sheet challenges and greater demographic challenges. It doesn't have challenges of the type that face a sclerotic Europe, but it has challenges nonetheless. When you look at the United States economy, there are certainly pockets of strength. I happen to live in one in California, and there are places where the U.S. economy is very competitive on a global basis. But for the length and breadth of the U.S. economy, and in particular for many actors in the U.S. economy, people whose skill sets are such that they don't generate enough utility to enjoy the standard of living that Americans had come to expect in the 1960s and 1970s, the strength that we see in the U.S. economy is only a relative strength, not an absolute strength. And I think a strength that is characterized, among other things, by artificially low interest rates and by liquidity rather than by competitive strength against other countries or, in fact, solvency within the U.S. economy.
Now, I'd like to discuss more regarding your thoughts on the U.S. debt. I know you mentioned how the U.S. is about $20 trillion in debt. You have also mentioned, this was on an interview you did with USA Watchdog, Greg Hunter, and you were talking about the U.S. unfunded liabilities, and that is a lot larger. Those are a lot larger than, what's reported as the national debt of 20 trillion. This is over $100 trillion. So how do you think the U.S. will deal with this kind of, debt load, or, technically just unfunded liabilities? What is your perspective on how that'll get addressed?
I hope what happens, Elijah, is that your generation says to my generation, enough is enough. The unfunded liabilities are, in effect, promises that society has made to itself, where the benefits are enjoyed by my generation and the liability is assumed by your generation. These are things like Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. Off-balance sheet liabilities in the sense that they aren't evidenced by a bond or an indenture, but they are so-called entitlements, that is, benefits from the Commonwealth that individuals have come by law to believe that they are entitled to. And the truth is that the Congressional Budget Office, not some crank like Rick Rule, has suggested that the net present value of these liabilities exceeds $100 trillion. And so when you combine our off-balance sheet liabilities, that is the promises that we've made to each other, and our on-balance sheet liabilities, just at the federal level, before state and local obligations and before unfunded or underfunded pension liabilities, the obligations that we have as a society at the federal level exceed $120 trillion. It's interesting to have this conversation with living, breathing human beings in an investment conference, because the enormity of $120 trillion doesn't show up in their facial expression. It's as though that number is a farcical number, not understandable, so in that sense, not being worth being worried about. But the truth is that the arithmetic associated with it is very worrisome to people who can add and subtract.
Definitely. And how do you see the U.S. dealing with these unfunded liabilities? You were talking about how a lot of other, people in the financial sector, really the enormity of $120 trillion, they just don't really understand it. It doesn't seem to show up on their faces, as you were saying. But really, it seems like there's no way out besides devaluing the currency. Is that your view?
Well, I guess there's two ways out. If you faced it honestly, you would have an ugly political fight in the country, but you could say to people, as an example, Social Security was enacted at a point in time when the average life expectancy of an American male was 64 years, and it sustained you at the poverty level from age 65 on. The average life expectancy of an American male now is 84. If you were to increase the years that you were required to live on Earth before you could acquire Social Security from its current 62 to, say, 75 or 80, you would skate Social Security onside. In other words, you could, by being honest with society, reduce fairly substantially the off-balance sheet liabilities that face the American populace. That would be, of course, hugely unpopular with old folks such as myself. And the American political system, I think it's fair to say, doesn't run on honesty. But the easiest way to deal with these liabilities is simply to legislate them away, the same way that we legislated them in existence. But I don't think that'll happen. I think saying to people who have counted on these government programs that they're unaffordable and as a consequence of that won't occur is probably a recipe for a level of social disruption that the political class and the voters in the country aren't willing to assume. Saying to people simply with regards to Medicare and Medicaid that to the extent that they're partially responsible themselves for their medical condition, that is saying to people who smoke, saying to people who have problems with alcohol or drugs, saying to people who are obese that in some way, shape, or form their current dilemma is of their own authorship, and as a consequence of that, the liability for it shouldn't be socialized. While there is certainly a moral argument for that, it isn't the way that this country has operated for the last 50 years. And it seems to me to be politically unpalatable. So my suspicion is that you're correct. In the absence of society being honest with each other, my suspicion is that we will be dishonest and we will inflate away the net present value of the obligation rather than denouncing or renouncing those same obligations.
Now, the interesting thing is those two options really have essentially the same effect. It just looks different. And maybe immediately, if, a politician was to say, well, we're going to increase the Social Security age and we're going to take away these, entitlements and so on, then people would immediately have a bad reaction to that. They wouldn't vote for that politician and so on. But really, devaluing the currency really has the same effect in the long run.
Yes, and I think it's a discussion that really your generation needs to have. You're going to have to pay for it. The idea that my generation is in some way going to willingly vote to reduce our own standard of living, particularly where that standard of living comes at your expense, isn't going to occur. It's a discipline that you're going to need to impose on us. It's one more example of the fact that eventually the children become parents and the parents become children.
Definitely. Now, I was wondering about your perspective on how this will all impact the gold and silver market. So we're kind of looking, we started this interview looking maybe at the short term where you see gold and silver prices heading in the mining sector. But if we take a step back, look at the big picture, with unfunded liabilities at over $120 trillion, as you mentioned, and it seems like the only way out that, politicians will dare to do will to devalue the debt instead of actually, defaulting in any way. So how do you see this devaluation of the currency impacting gold and silver prices in the long run?
Well, if you go down the road to gradual devaluation, particularly if you attempt to keep interest rates artificially cheap, what you do is you begin to seriously erode faith in U.S. government securities, that is the U.S. 10-year Treasury. And if you begin to erode faith in the currency, and in particular, the currency as expressed by U.S. government bonds, you begin to divert some of the money that flows into the U.S. 10-year Treasury and other treasuries from those products to gold and silver. That's what happened during the decade of the 1970s. And the result of that was that although interest rates rose, the currency devalued faster, and the diversion of assets from treasury securities into gold was such that the gold price ran from $35 an ounce to $850 an ounce. I'm not suggesting to you that the quantum of the move will be great this time, but my suggestion is that the same factors will be at play that happened then. A combination of reduction of faith in the purchasing power of the dollar, and the consequence of that would be the reduction of market share in savings instruments enjoyed by U.S. government securities in favor of gold and silver, I suspect is something that we'll see in the next 5 or 6 years. It's worth pointing out, by the way, that we have enjoyed a bull market in bonds in particular, but U.S. government securities that began really in 1982 and has continued from 1982 all the way to 2017. This is an amazing bull market, a 35-year bull market. And I'm not suggesting that that bull market is at an end, but if you think about the fact that it's been existent for 35 years, and during that period of time, the bond prices have increased to the extent that the yields have declined from 15.5 in the U.S. 10-year Treasury down to somewhere in the 2% range, that suggests to me that in and of its own volition, that 35-year bull market is closer to the end than to the beginning. And if you believe, as I do, that gold trades in many ways contra to the U.S. 10-year Treasury, that would suggest that the gold bull market is, by contrast, closer to the beginning than to the end.
Now, you mentioned the bond market, and I'd like to discuss more about that. because I recently had a guest on my show, Michael Pento, and he was talking about, in his view, that the global bond market, so not just in the United States, but the global bond market, is really the biggest asset bubble in history. He talked about how by keeping interest rates low, the Fed and other central banks have really deformed the bond market and really created this huge bubble. And now, in other countries, there's about $14 trillion of debt that has a negative yield, which just seems completely ridiculous if you look at that. So what is your perspective on the bond market? Do you think it's in a huge bubble right now?
Well, I think Michael's a better one to ask in that he's more of an economist than I am. I'm more of a credit analyst. I must say, as a credit analyst, the idea that I am taking credit risk at the same time that I'm not being paid to assume it is a little silly. The idea that I'm paying someone to use my money is, on the face of it, absurd. And to that extent, I guess I would have to agree with Mr. Pento. It makes no sense to pay somebody to employ my savings for no yield to me. And I would ask your listeners to ask themselves that question. Does it make any sense that you allow somebody else to employ the fruits of your labor, your savings, for no yield to you, to get no compensation at all for credit risk and no compensation at all for the time value of money? It makes no sense to me.
Definitely. Well, Rick Rule, thank you so much for joining us today. Before we let you go, did you want to share with the viewers any last thoughts you had? And I was wondering, as we look at this, I don't know, it seems like whenever we talk about the economy and, for example, also the bond market, it seems like it's almost like we're watching a slow motion train wreck. And a lot of people might think, it looks like there's really a negative future. It seems like there's this collapse that's going to happen in the future. And it doesn't always, if we're prepared, it doesn't have to be so negative, I guess. So in what ways do you think that people can prepare for the coming crisis?
Well, I wouldn't describe myself as negative at all. For all the bad things you want to say about America's culture, it's still the most innovative, aspirational culture on the planet. It's still a place where 4 or 5 young, pimply-faced kids can commandeer a garage in Silicon Valley, and Facebook or Google pops out of it. And so the truth is, despite the fact that the arithmetic around us presents some challenges, we have ways out of the challenges, and my suspicion is that we'll find it. My suspicion is, however, that people who believe in collective solutions, that is, people who don't believe that they have a responsibility for their own financial future, will experience some very bad years. I think that one needs to take control of one's own financial future and not look to the government or other members of society to do that for them. One needs to do things as simple as saving 10% of pre-tax income, that is, pay yourself first. One needs to both save and invest prudently. One needs to live below one's means so that liquidity crises for other people become opportunities for you yourself. And to the extent that people do that, invest in themselves, invest in their careers, save and invest in a financial sense, you will have the opportunity to turn what is for most people a challenge into an opportunity for you yourself. You owe it to yourself, and in fact, you owe it to society to thrive in what are for other people very challenging times. And my suspicion is that the people who are taking the time to listen to broadcasts like yours, which are rare, have taken the first step to thriving where others will attempt to survive.
All right. Before we let you go, Rick Rule, did you want to share with the viewers where they can find you? I know they can find you on your website, also your YouTube channel, Twitter, and any last thoughts you'd like to add?
Well, certainly we would encourage your listeners to subscribe to Sprott's Thoughts, which is the in-house blog for the Sprott organization, featuring not just my best ideas, but the best ideas from within the Sprott organization and also from people outside the organization whose information we think is of value. You can do that by going to our website, sprottglobal.com, SPROTTGLOBAL.com, and hitting contact, and we will subscribe you to Sprott's Thoughts. I guarantee that you'll get your money's worth, first of all, because it's a good product, but secondly, because it's absolutely free.
Great. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
This video was brought to you in part by ReluctantPreppers.com, helping you be aware and prepared. Click here to watch one of Reluctant Prepper's latest interviews.